Hey all, welcome back to Developing Roots. You're probably wondering why you are hearing my voice and not seeing my face. The reason for that is I have teamed up with another local homesteader to me, Molly from Black Dirt Homestead, to start a podcast. And so this channel will be changing over to the Roots and Dirt podcast. By the time you're listening to this, you probably have already noticed that, or will notice now when you look down at the little name thingy and see that it says Roots and Dirts podcast instead of Developing Roots. We hope that you will enjoy this change. We're excited. We will be doing video eventually, but for now we're just kind of getting used to the whole podcast setup, and we hope that you will enjoy this new change. Today you're going to listen to the introductions. I should say today and over the next podcast. We'll probably release them simultaneously, but there will be two separate podcasts where Molly and I are just simply going to introduce ourselves, and then we can't wait. We have so much content already recorded. We're hoping to release podcasts each Friday. There may be an occasional time where they come out closer together than that. We also have a website, Roots and Dirt Podcast, which I will put down in the description. You can pop on over there. There will be blog content along with all kinds of other stuff. We're excited to get started. We hope that you enjoy this new change. And with that, I'll welcome you to the first episode of the Roots and Dirt Podcast. Hey y'all, I'm going to be taking part one of the introduction to the podcast. This is Letta with Developing Roots. And the homesteading journey for me is definitely not your typical homesteading story. I didn't start out with a goal to remove our family from the normal American global food system. I was simply a young woman who had found great healing in the garden. It was a still, quiet place where I could rest my soul and hear the Lord speak to me. I don't know if you all are familiar with the song, I Come to the Garden Alone, and actually I don't even know if that's the name of the song, but the words are, I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, none other will ever know. I remember my mom singing that song to me while she was still with us, and it became sort of a siren call to the garden. As I grew older living with my grandma, I would spend my work money and my grandma's money on plans to create flower gardens in her backyard. I did the same thing at my house, the house that my husband and I moved to after we were married. That song would play in the background of my mind, and I would remember my mom. A few years in at the same house, my husband put in a small space for a vegetable garden in our backyard. It was my first real experience growing vegetables rather than just flowers, and it felt good to bring a little food inside to eat fresh with our summer meals. An older man that lived a couple houses down from us that could no longer garden would come by every day and grab one tomato for his bride, which he called her, and himself to eat that day. And thus it became a sort of community garden where I learned the joy of sharing what was grown of the earth with others. Move forward 6 years later, and we were expecting our third baby, and we purchased my in-laws' home just a few blocks away from where we were already at. Their yard was already beautifully landscaped with shrubbery, perennials, and annual flowers that she actually kept alive, unlike myself. In the back were two large apple trees with a bit of space in between them that housed some perennial flowers, and in front of that was a little border where she planted annual flowers each year, and in that border I planted a handful of tomato and pepper plants instead. I had decided when our third child was born that I was no longer going to work outside of the home. At this point, my walk with the Lord had grown quite strong. I was leading women's Bible studies and desiring to follow his call in my life. Well, we had an amazing woman who really became a second grandma to our kiddos. I was tired of having someone else raise my children for me. We knew it would require sacrifice. We had been following Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University program for a while, so we were very well aware of the bare minimum that we needed to bring in and pay for our bills and feed and clothe our family. My husband would need to work more hours, and we would need to scale down our spending. It was 1000% worth every sacrifice made. My husband working longer hours was incredibly difficult sometimes, but our kids had at least one parent with them at all times, and that was what mattered to us. We adjusted and we learned to take advantage of every hour that he had off. Our life didn't look like others around us, including family and friends, and that was sort of the point. We didn't want what the world had to offer us. A couple of years after moving here, a huge storm went through our town, and we lost both of the large apple trees in our backyard. Missing my gardens, I asked my husband if he could till the ground so I could plant a vegetable garden back there. It wasn't a huge space, but it wasn't small either. We're talking roughly an 8 by 60 foot, so long and skinny garden space. Now, keep in mind what I was talking about before with him working longer hours. The last thing he wanted to do when he came home in the evenings was weed a garden. So his response to me was, "Sure, as long as you keep it weeded. If I have to start weeding it, I'm planting it into grass." And thus commenced a long and beautiful journey. I kept that garden meticulously weeded. It became a place I could go to sort of escape my children for a few moments of peace. I would pray and meditate out there, and I could clearly hear the Spirit teaching me through the tasks I was performing. The garden taught me to be diligent in my work. It taught me lessons about different types of weeds in the garden and what those same weeds looked like in my life. It taught me things about my marriage and how to be a good parent. And it taught me countless other lessons, which I'll share over time on the Roots and Dirt blog. We ate well out of the garden that year, and I learned to preserve green beans and salsa from bloggers and other YouTubers, even though YouTubing was just starting to kind of take off and be a big thing. That was the first year I realized that I could really supplement our income by growing our food. Rather than go to a job that had taxes and gas money and daycare expenses taken out of the paycheck before I could go to the store and buy food, I could simply walk into my backyard and harvest it. Not to mention the fact that it was so much better for us. I had never sprayed a drop of anything on it, and it went directly from the garden into our mouths. It was also way more convenient than running to the grocery store with a whole bunch of little people in tow. So the next year, I asked my husband to make that garden just a little bit wider. And because I had been diligent in my work, he did. We ditched the decorative border that was there when it was a flower bed and straightened the edge out. As our children grew and ate more like adults, I was looking for space to grow more food to fill the bottomless pits of bellies that they had. Our youngest, at the same time, had been born with some kidney problems and the same dairy allergy that I suffer from, so we pretty much cooked everything from scratch and preserved as much as we could of our own food. I added raised beds to the edge of the garden. I used my decorative planters to grow what I deemed the pretty herbs and vegetables, and we shopped local farmers markets for what we couldn't grow. We ate locally raised meat that we could feel good about consuming. 6 years later, our youngest was given a clean bill of health with no permanent damage done to his kidneys. The Lord had protected his body, and I learned for the second time around that food should be thy medicine. Now fast forward, it's 2019, and I had felt prompted to finally put a garden out on some land that my husband's family gardened on. We had been offered before, but our kiddos were young, and I didn't think that we would have the ability to manage it well if it wasn't right in my backyard. But the promptings to put a garden out there were so strong that in 2019 we finally bit the bullet, and I grew a bunch of storage crops out there. Things like carrots, beets, potatoes, winter squash, drying beans, and a bunch more tomatoes and peppers, of course. At this point, I was already implementing systems that allowed me to garden out there without much weeding, and we were able to bring in enough vegetables to last us in cold storage through the early winter. At the end of the season, I felt quite strongly that I should purchase my seeds for the following season right away. I was already growing plant starts to sell at this point, and I wanted to up my game to help pay for the extended garden space that we had created. Little did I know that 2020 was right around the corner. That late winter here in Minnesota, when the shelves were empty at the grocery store, we still had fresh carrots and beets in our fridge. We still had dried beans on the shelf, and meals put up in jars sitting in my pantry. When the seed stores were all sold out of seeds, I had already purchased mine, and in such abundance that I was able to provide our local community with plants and seeds to start their own gardens so that they could provide for their families. You see, over the years, the garden didn't just heal my soul of pain from my past. It didn't just grow food for our family, but it taught me to listen and respond to what the Lord was speaking to me. It's part of why we're sitting here creating this podcast now. My experience of God's provision when you live closely in tune with Him was written in stone that year, and I never looked back. I've learned a multitude of practical skills and even more about life through my years of gardening, and I can't wait to share those things and continue to learn together through this podcast. We hope you'll join us for part 2, where you can hear Molly's story on how she got started in homesteading. Thank you for joining us on the Roots and Dirt podcast.